Welcome to Ten8. Ten8 is a more personal and journal-style series of articles by myself that will center around police management, criminology, and policing. The articles will not be the typical citation-driven essay style that I use. For those articles, please see my Medium page, published books such as Amazon, especially The Business of Policing, Volume 1, Crimes and Punishments in the 21st Century, or scientific published literature highlighted by The Business of Policing, Volume 2, Managing Ethical Police Conduct. Here I will post frequent thought streams on my personal philosophies. Thanks for listening in. Neo-racism, the evolution of the racist. For some reason, I have found myself incredibly involved in the topic of race. You all can formulate your theories about that, but I am someone who could not find race to be more boring of a discussion. I cannot fathom how much of a bunch of baboons we are that we hold on to this fabricated concept like a pacifier for our self-loathing. It all reminds me of one of my favorite cartoons in my youth, The Far Side. I would sit in libraries and stores and read the whole book, calendar, comic, strips, etc. They were great. In the one I am remembering, the aliens finally came to Earth and asked the dogs to take them to their leader, the head dog. The joke being that from the outside, it would appear obvious that dogs have domesticated humans. One does whatever it wants, and the other is the servant. That is still a human-centric perspective. The aliens would probably come to visit the squid or octopi. Another that frequently comes to mind is the one with the bird's eye view of the world that has bullseyes on all the people's heads. I guess I am projecting that if I were a bird, I would fly around crapping on humans. Well, I would not limit myself to humans. Back to the topic. I'm often mentioning how much I have been around and how much access I have had for a few years after the killing of Freddie Gray and the Baltimore protests in response. It was critical in informing my greater understanding, though. In retrospect, I would have just kept my mouth shut and lived my life. I hate the idea of how much I have contributed to providing the grounding narrative which spun wildly out of control. In Baltimore and my media appearances, we talked about the systemic flaws within policing. Some of them produce racist outcomes, and we as a profession need to fix those issues. Regardless of intent, they just have bad outcomes. Police needed to know the community better, and they needed more training. The discussion was about getting Freddie Gray to prison safely, and I was seen as radical for wanting to discuss if we should have been stopping him at all that day, or how we played a role in putting him in that situation. Somehow, that evolved into the police themselves are racist, and they needed to be abolished. As the narrative grew, the left-biased media slowly stopped engaging me as I presented arguments against the growing narrative. The right-biased media never would engage, for the record. I tried, but I suppose they already knew that a large portion of my argument would dispel their preconceived narratives. And once you make people challenge those narratives, it takes a piece of their identity from them. Naturally, it takes a person to be in a rare state of growth to be willing to seek such challenges. I have observed the rise of neo-racism firsthand in multiple venues. Classes, and circles. Neo-racism in white. Before mainstream media began using me as a pawn, I was on a podcast talking about how prior policies, practices, laws, and institutions contribute towards the disparities and conditions that breed crime, and how the racism of the past lingers in the outcomes of today. The host argued and resoundingly disagreed with everything I was saying in traditional conservative principles of individual accountability, rational choice, equal opportunity over equal outcome. I defended peaceful protests when blocking the streets. Please keep in mind that back then, protesters let emergency vehicles through and were not being destructive. Granted, that was a very short window. The host thought my defense was preposterous. After the show and over the years, we had many talks on the topic. At first, he began to understand the arguments I was making, such as my traditional lead poisoning, lack of resources, housing, and food deserts. Somewhere along the line, I found myself making grimace faces as I was suddenly defending policing because his narrative became that all cops are racist. I knew how the conversations were going quite well, and hopefully you see it on display by politicians, especially liberal ones. Be honest. Accuse your enemy of doing what you are doing and believing what you believe. I know that is propaganda tactics, but this is not a conscious phenomenon. It is in the subconscious, in the realm of projection. It becomes easy to assume that others think like you do, so you accuse them of doing what you would do with their power or in their situation. Now, to this person, I'm a far-right racist. There is something that happens in those drawn to these types of ideologies. I have heard it said as the bigotry of low expectations. It is not quite that there is an open acknowledgement that they are racist. Still, they classify everyone into racial groups, speak for those people, and tell them how they have been victimized, support them each time they complain of victimization, and see part of the mission as to recruit other whites into these textbook racist beliefs. They tell white people to shut up because white people cannot really be victims. The implications are barely hidden. How can you be victimized when you are the superior race? Eventually, they find themselves calling vast swaths of black Americans white supremacists, even to the extremes like with Daryl Davis. Neo-racism in brown. Browns are seen more as allies, closer to white as they are in crime demographics. They, at least on the neo-racism ideology, place themselves somewhere between the two. They feel privileged enough to scold white people and think that they need to help and sacrifice for black people. If they saw white as lower, then they could not call them into action. Really, you can only help those lower than you on the hierarchy of the discussion, this discussion being social status and victimization. They do not need necessarily help as those black people do, but they aren't to blame. And you know what? White people hold them down too. Neo-racism in black. Most black Americans are not racist. They are just like the rest of us, wondering what the hell is going on. But these activist ones could not be more racist, and blatantly so. My experiences have shown that 100% of these people are in a quest for personal power. The only thing they have going for them is classifying themselves as having special knowledge and rights from their oppression, and they need the white and brown racists around them and at their allies to be continually reinforced about their oppression because they surround themselves with racists. I've seen a similar thing happen with contemporary feminists surrounding themselves with misogynists. These groups together have become powerful enough to start chipping away at the moral and cultural gains of the civil rights movement. In California, they are attempting to officially legally end state civil rights protections to enable racial discrimination in government hiring practices. Seriously. POC this, non-POC that, black only, POC only. The cultural war had been won. Kids born in the 80s had little to no idea what racism was until it was brought back rather recently. America felt guilty about its past, and any thoughts of superiority met public scrutiny. When that occasional racist thought popped up, the lessons of history and the new normal reminded people that it was a bad idea, that they were entirely wrong for thinking it, empirically and morally. Then, the anti-racism began to creep into society, along with mass communication, victimhood, participation trophies, outrage culture, and others that created this seemingly unique moment in history. You cannot do anti-racism without classifying people into victim status and race, a hierarchy-based race, the very definition of racism. Let us take a quick look at an example that is quite obvious, that I was just oblivious to and had to learn the hard way. Here's an example of the preaching of neo-racism in 2013. In the African American community, at least, there's a lot of pain around what happened here. I think it's important to recognize that the African American community is looking at this issue through a set of experiences, a history that doesn't go away. There are very few African American men in this country who haven't had the experience of being followed when they were shopping in a department store. That includes me. There are very few African American men who haven't had the experience of walking across the street and hearing the locks click on the doors of cars. That happens to me, at least before I was a senator. There are very few African Americans who haven't had the experience of getting on an elevator and a woman clutching her purse nervously and holding her breath until she had a chance to get off. I think to a sense that if a white male teen was involved in the same kind of scenario, that from top to bottom, both the outcome and the aftermath might have been different. I passed racial profiling legislation, and it actually did just two simple things. One, it collected data on traffic stops and the race of the person who was stopped. But the other thing was it resourced us training police departments across the state on how to think about potential racial bias. I passed racial profiling legislation, and it actually did just two simple things. One, it collected data on traffic stops and the race of the person who was stopped. But the other thing was it resourced us training police departments across the state on how to think about potential racial bias. We need to spend some time in thinking about how do we bolster and reinforce our African American boys. President Barack Obama. Do you see how doing any of this requires classifying people into races, even those that don't wish to be? Creating a hierarchy of oppression? The cop, representative of the state, must racially classify you. And there are no boxes for half black, half Asian Jew. You are going to be the one we decide. On top of it, what's said here is not true of every American community, of every American male. People lock their doors all the time in Baltimore when I crossed the street in a tank top and shorts or crept around in an alley with my hoodie up, and I was a plainclothes cop. It says it stopped for him when he became a senator. How funny. The only thing being accomplished is the division of Americans into racial subgroups. Racism. Additionally, this whole speech is framed as though George Zimmerman was white. As pointed out earlier, he's brown. For some reason, he is white when convenient and brown when convenient to the narrative. And I must point out this lie as an example of what I recently wrote in another Ten8 article titled Police Respond to Race. 3% of the population is committing 53% of the violence. It is a gross, willful, and intentional lie to frame disproportionality based on demographics. Again, police respond to violence. Shall we fix the disproportionality of males to females? Shouldn't 51% of prisoners be females in the name of equality? Proportionality? It is frustratingly stupid.